Good morning. We are glad to have you here with us for lesson 2 of Finding Jesus in the Hebrew Feast, and we are looking at Passover today. There is so much involved in this study that there's no way to do it in one session. So we're going to be breaking this up into at least 2 different sessions. We've been seeing how God has provided shadows or models to help us understand what he's up to in the world. And you can think of these as God's visual aids. He uses them as, I guess you could say, kind of object lessons to teach us spiritual truths. And just like children, we use our physical senses to better understand non-tangible ideas, to better understand truths. And so God started teaching his covenant people, the Jews, really important preparatory lessons through various religious laws and rituals that they were to observe through their physical senses, because he was preparing them for deeper spiritual truths which would come to full light in Jesus. And after having only pictures, shadows, we sometimes call these, or models, then time came for them to experience the reality of what all these shadows or these pictures, these object lessons had been pointing to. And it was Jesus of Nazareth, the Jewish Messiah, the Savior of the world. And Dr. Richard Booker says, while the Hebrew scriptures provided the pictures, the New Testament provided the person. And all of these pictures in the Old Testament, the Hebrew scriptures, they all point to the person of Jesus Christ in the New Testament. Now, God ordained appointed times or festival times as part of these pictures. And these were occasions for Israel to gather together before him, to remember that they were his special people, to remember significant times in their history with him. And these would be times of celebration of his faithfulness. But these times had even deeper significance. We see that significance only as we look at Jesus. These 7 festival times typify the sequence and the timing and the significance of the major events of what we could call Jesus' redemptive career. Now, we know that these spring feasts, they happen in a very short period of time, even overlapping each other. The 3 that really overlap are Passover and the Feast of Unleavened Bread and First Fruits. And those all take place within 1 week. And then 50 days from First Fruits, you count out 50 days, and that then is Pentecost. And all Israel, at least the men, are commanded to come to Jerusalem for these 3 feast times. They come for Passover week, which includes unleavened bread and first fruits. They come 50 days later for Pentecost, and then they will come later in the fall for the fall holidays. Now, to get an idea of what this must have been like for Passover week, just imagine for a minute that you are at an airport. You're at a boarding gate for a flight to Israel several days before Passover, and people are gathering to fly to Jerusalem. The men and the women are all jammed together, and the kids are crying and laughing and running around playing on the floor. Now imagine that there are 250,000 families in this group, and each family, in addition to their luggage, has a sheep by a rope. And everybody has to camp out for a week in the terminal before getting on the plane. Now, you're just beginning to get a picture of what Jerusalem would have been like at Passover at the time of Jesus. Josephus is a Jewish historian who lived during the time of the New Testament writers, and he writes that on Passover, now get this, the population of Jerusalem swelled to more than 2 million people as Jews made the pilgrimage to Jerusalem from wherever they were for this annual celebration of Israel's liberation from slavery in Egypt. So today we're going to look at the origin of this festival and the way it was practiced for hundreds of years. And then we're at the ways the celebration changed after it was established at the temple. And then we're going to look at Jesus, who is our Passover lamb. So we know that the feast was ordained by God. Leviticus 23, we read this portion last week. The Lord said to Moses, "You have 6 days following instructions to the people of Israel. But the seventh day are the Lord's is a Sabbath day of complete rest, an official day for holy assembly. It is the Lord's Sabbath day, and it must be observed wherever you live." So we see here that the first of the ordained days for people to gather together before the Lord is the weekly Sabbath. It's the seventh day of each week, what we know as Saturday. Now, that deserves a study all by itself. So we're not going to be considering the Sabbath in this series. We're going to be considering the 7 main feasts that happen in the year. Verse 4, in addition to the Sabbath, these are the Lord's appointed festivals, the official days for holy assembly that are to be celebrated at their proper times each year. The Lord's Passover begins at sundown on the 14th day of the month, of the first month. Remember last week we saw that was Nisan. So on the 14th of Nisan, the Lord's Passover begins at sundown. On the next day, now let me back up a minute, and you're going to hear me repeating this over and over again because it's critical for us to understand the timeline. We have to realize that, let's just say, for example, that the 14th of Nisan was on Tuesday. Nobody thinks it is, but I'm just saying, let's say that we think it's on the Tuesday. Well, that means that it would begin at sundown on our Monday. That's when the Jewish day begins. So at sundown, the Jewish day starts. That would be the 14th of Nisan. And it goes from sundown until sundown, not from midnight till midnight. So the Lord's Passover begins at sundown on the 14th day of the first month. On the next day, the 15th day of the month, you must begin celebrating the festival of unleavened bread. This festival to the Lord continues for 7 days, and during that time, the bread you eat must be made without yeast. On the first day of the festival, all the people must stop their ordinary work and observe an official day for holy assembly. Now put that in your pocket for a minute because that's important. For 7 days, you must present special gifts to the Lord. And on the 7th day, the people must again stop all their ordinary work to observe an official day for holy assembly. So here we have Passover on the 14th of Nisan and Feast of Unleavened Bread beginning on the 15th. Now, Passover itself is not a Sabbath. But the 1st and 7th days of unleavened bread are, but they're called high Sabbaths. It's what's referred to here as an official day for holy assembly. And these high Sabbaths throughout the year, and there are several, they usually do occur on different days than the weekly Sabbath on Saturday. They are in addition to the weekly Sabbath. So Passover and the Feast of Unleavened Bread overlap. They are part of the same celebration, but their significance differs, and you'll see this as we get into the study of how Jesus fits into this. And then at the end of the Feast of Unleavened, no, excuse me, not at the end of, immediately following the day that is the Feast of Unleavened Bread, we have the Feast of First Fruits. And so you've got one day is Passover, the second day of this Passover week is the Feast of Unleavened Bread, and the third day is, the next day is the Feast of First Fruits. So we read about it. Then the Lord said to Moses, give the following instructions to the people of Israel. When you enter the land I'm giving you and you harvest its first crops, bring the priest a bundle of grain from the first cutting of your grain harvest. On the day after the Sabbath, that's the regular weekly Sabbath, the priest will lift it up before the Lord so it may be accepted on your behalf. On that same day, you must sacrifice a 1-year-old male lamb with no defects as a burnt offering to the Lord. With it, you must present a grain offering consisting of 4 quarts of choice flour moistened with olive oil. It will be a special gift, a pleasing aroma to the Lord. You must also offer 1 quart of wine as a liquid offering. Do not eat any bread or roasted grain or fresh kernels on that day until you bring this offering to your God. This is a permanent law for you, and it must be observed from generation to generation wherever you live. Now, that's the description of the Feast of First Fruits. And I have to read all of this together as we go into Passover in order for us to really get a picture of how Jesus fulfilled Passover, Feast of Unleavened Bread, and First Fruits in his death and burial and resurrection. So we know that the first of these 7 ordained feasts is Passover. It's the foundational feast. All the other feasts are built on it. We know that it occurs on the 14th day of the Hebrew month of Aviv, which was also Nisan. It was changed to Nisan after the Babylonian captivity. And on our calendar, this is March or April. And this date begins the religious year for the Jews. This is the first month of their year. Now, Passover is both a feast day and a festival season that includes unleavened bread and Feast of First Fruits. And to be able to really understand the sequence of events, we have to keep in mind that Passover Day is the day before the first day of the Feast of Unleavened Bread. It is a preparation day for the high Sabbath of the Feast of Unleavened Bread. And I know I'm really hitting this hard, but it's important for us to understand that as we move into what actually went on during that Jesus last week. Now, the Hebrew people have celebrated Passover annually since the time of Moses, but the Passover itself only happened once. And this, you know the story of that. The Hebrews were enslaved by the Egyptians. They had been for generations. After Joseph's family had grown and grown and grown, they grew so large that they were feared that they might be a threat. And so they were pressed into slavery in every sense of the word. And when they were delivered, they were not the organized, rule-driven society that they became. For years and years and years, they had been enslaved in every sense of the word. They were uneducated, they were unorganized, they were covered in mud and slime from the big brick pits. We don't even have any evidence that most of them even remembered who their God was and things that he had said. But here's the key point. Their God remembered them. He identified himself to them as the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And he had solemnly promised those men that their seed would be as numerous as the stars. And their God is a covenant-keeping God. And the Hebrews, as unattractive and undesirable as they may have appeared to be at that time, they were still his called out people, and he was at work. He chose Moses to lead them to freedom. In Exodus 3, 7, 10, we read this. God says to Moses, he takes the initiative on this whole thing. He stops Moses dead, stone cold still when he's out in the wilderness keeping sheep. And God says to him, I have seen the misery of my people in Egypt. I have heard them crying out because of their slave drivers, and I'm concerned about their suffering. So I've come down to rescue them from the hand of the Egyptians and to bring them up out of that land into a good and spacious land, a land flowing with milk and honey. So now go. I'm sending you to Pharaoh to bring my people, the Israelites, out of Egypt. Well, Moses went under protest, and as he expected, Pharaoh was defiant. He wasn't having any of it. And so God sent the 10 plagues that we know about, showing his authority over each one of Egypt's gods. And with each plague, Pharaoh's heart just grew harder and harder, and he refused to release the people. In spite of the frogs and the flies and the locust and the blood and the 3 days of darkness that covered Egypt. And they said that darkness that covered Egypt was so dark it could be felt. Exodus 10:21 says that. And then Pharaoh threatens Moses with death if he ever came before him again. So then the Lord told Moses that he had one more plague for Pharaoh, and then they'd be allowed to go. And he instructs Moses to give very specific instructions to the Israelites so that they would be spared from this plague, because this plague would bring death to every Egyptian family, and all the firstborn sons would die, including Pharaoh's son. And so from Exodus 12, we read, the Lord gave Moses instructions for the people. From now on, this month will be the first month of the year for you. And last week we looked at how this month is identified. We know that it is Nisan, because God changed Israel's calendar to make this month, the month of Nisan, the first in their year. He says, announce to the whole community of Israel that on the 10th day of this month, the 10th of Nisan, each family must choose a lamb or a young goat for a sacrifice, one animal for each household. You see, the Passover affects everybody. The whole community of Israel has to be involved. God says, if a family is too small to eat a whole animal, then let them share with another family in the neighborhood. Divide the animal according to the size of each family and how much they can eat. Now, none of the lamb was to be left over. It had to be fully consumed before midnight there on Passover day. The animal you select must be a 1-year-old male, either a sheep or a goat, with no defects. Take special care of this chosen animal until the evening of the 14th day of the first month. Then the whole assembly of the community of Israel must slaughter their lamb or young goat at twilight on the 14th. Now, at twilight on the 14th is the end of the 14th. It's not the beginning, it's the end of the 14th. So from the 10th to the 14th of Nisan, the family, on the 10th, the family would choose a lamb, they would bring it home with them, they would keep it until the 14th, and they would inspect it really closely to make sure that it was perfect. And during that time, it would become precious to the family. The slaughter would be a personal thing. It'd be like killing the family pet. And twilight is the time, according to Jews, their reckoning, twilight was the time between the sun's decline and sunset. And that's like between 3 to 5-ish in the afternoon. And all of Israel was involved in the kill. So verse 7 says, they are to take some of the blood and smear it on the sides and top of the door frames of the houses where they eat the animal. You see, once the animal was dead, the family had to do two things. They had to apply its blood to the doorpost and the lintel above the door opening, and then they had to eat the lamb. And we'll come back to that. That same night, they must roast the meat over a fire and eat it along with bitter salad greens and bread made without yeast. The lamb had to be eaten, completely consumed the same night. The bitter herbs represented the slavery of Egypt and the hardship of Egypt, and the unleavened bread reminded them that they were eating it that night because they were going to leave in a hurry and they would not have time for their bread to rise. And also, another thing that's important is that leaven is represented throughout Scripture as sin and impurity. Then God continues and he says, do not eat any of the meat raw or boiled in water. The whole animal, including the head, legs, and internal organs, must be roasted over a fire. Do not leave any of it until the next morning. Burn whatever is not eaten before morning. And these are your instructions for eating it. This is the first Passover. This is how they were to eat it. Be fully dressed, wear your sandals, and carry your walking stick in your hand. Eat the meal with urgency, for this is the Lord's Passover. On that night, I will pass through the land of Egypt and strike down every firstborn son and firstborn male animal in the land of Egypt. I will execute judgment against all the gods of Egypt, for I am the Lord. But the blood on your doorpost will serve as a sign, marking the houses where you are staying. And when I see the blood, I will pass over you. This plague of death will not touch you when I strike the land of Egypt. Now, one of the helpful resources on the background of this ritual is an article or book called The Threshold Covenant by H. Clay Trumbull. And in ancient times, and even today in the Middle East, there is a custom called the Threshold Covenant. And this is where people make covenants with one another by putting the blood of an animal at the threshold of their door, the bottom part of the door that you step over as you enter a home. And in the Eastern world, the threshold was the most sacred part of the entire house. It was where covenants were made with one another. That blood was placed on the threshold there as a reminder that every time they went in and out of the house, that covenant was in effect. And that's where they also made sacrifices to their deities. And we are used to thinking of a basin as this pan that we hold in our hands. But in ancient times, the threshold of the door actually had a little built-in basin that was used to catch the blood of the animals that would be slain there as part of their sacrifices. So the Hebrew word for Passover is Pesach. It's P-E-S-A-C-H, pronounced Pesach. And it means to come under the protection of a deity by crossing over, jumping over, stepping over, skipping over, or leaping over something. In this case, it's the threshold. Now, this understanding of Pesach and the threshold covenant was not unique with the Jews. When early people dedicated their houses to their God, whoever that God might be, they often made a sacrifice at the threshold. And since they were making a sacred blood covenant with their God, they were very careful as they crossed over it. And this gives us some additional understanding of the Old Testament caution against trampling the blood of Christ underfoot. If they trampled on the threshold, they were showing contempt and rejection of the covenant that had been made there. Now, we, with a Western mindset, we understand Passover to mean that God just passed by those dwellings that were covered with blood. But the Eastern understanding is deeper than that. When the people applied the blood to the doorway at the threshold, they were inviting God to pass over or cross over the threshold into their home as the protector. And in a sense, you could say that God stood in the doorway, protecting the people inside the home from the death that was coming for all of Egypt. And then God finishes this up by saying, this is a day to remember. Each year, from generation to generation, you must celebrate it, Passover, as a special festival to the Lord. This is a law for all time. And Exodus 12 says, so the people of Israel did just as the Lord had commanded through Moses and Aaron. And that night at midnight, the Lord struck down all the firstborn sons in the land of Egypt, from the firstborn son of Pharaoh who sat on his throne to the firstborn son of the prisoner in the dungeon. Even the firstborn of their livestock were killed. Pharaoh and all his officials and all the people of Egypt woke up during the night, and loud wailing was heard throughout the land of Egypt. There was not a single house where someone had not died. This was the ultimate challenge to the Egyptians. Their entire society was built on the law of primogeniture, which the firstborn son legally inherited most of the family wealth and all of the father's authority. And this 10th plague struck at the heart of the Egyptians, emotionally, economically, culturally, and spiritually. And after Israel's delivery, the Lord spoke to Moses again, and he gave more instructions for this memorial feast. He says, each Passover lamb must be eaten in one house. Do not carry any of its meat outside, and do not break any of its bones. The whole community of Israel must celebrate this Passover festival. So let's summarize what we've read here about the requirements for the Passover feast. It's the first of the spring feast. It commemorates the night that God saved the Hebrew people with the blood of the lamb. Each man for this first Passover was to select a lamb without spot or blemish for his household. He selected it on the 10th of Nisan. He brought it into his house. He observed it until the 14th of Nisan to make sure that it had no flaws. There was nothing wrong with it. The lamb then would be slain, and its blood would be caught in a basin and then smeared on both sides of the door and over the doorpost. And then the family would enter their house through that blood-stained door that protected them from the plague of death that would move through the land. The meat could not be boiled. It had to be roasted over a fire on a spit. Now, this is the oldest continuously observed feast in the world. It's been observed for more than 3,500 years. And there have been, I guess you'd say, 3 phases or 3 forms of Passover, and each one has increased in its liturgy and its ceremony. This original Passover was observed only one time. It required only a lamb, unleavened bread, the matzah, and bitter herbs, and the family ate it standing, dressed for the journey, with their staff in their hand. Then for the next 850 years, they remembered this night. They commemorated this event with a very simple meal of lamb and matzah and herbs. And the lamb was, just like God had said, selected 4 days before Passover. On the 10th, it was brought into the family to be examined, and on the specified day, the 14th of Nisan, the family would slaughter it and roast it over a fire for a special meal. Then, at the end of that 850 years, Israel was captured by the Babylonians, and the Jews were taken away in captivity, and things changed, and we don't have a lot of information about how they celebrated in exile. But we know that when they returned from exile, Ezra taught them the law and reformed their religious life. so that the other nations around them could see that they were God's chosen nation. At that time, more liturgy was added to the Passover celebration. 4 cups of special wine were added, and this formal narrative became known as the Seder. And this was the ritual until the destruction of the temple in 70 AD, after the crucifixion of Jesus. Now, from post-temple time until today, the Seder has been even more fully developed, probably under the Greek influence, because the Greeks celebrated Saturnalia, which celebrated their freedom. And the Jews adopted some things from this Greek form, but they changed the content of it, and they added some key elements of the meal that they observe today. One is the charoset, a roasted egg, and an element known as the afikomen, and we're going to be talking about that. It's really important. But during the time of Jesus now, this was the basic form that was followed. Each family chose a lamb on the 10th of Nisan, kept it in the house, examining it until the 14th of Nisan. It would be sacrificed on the afternoon of the 14th. That's at the end of Nisan the 14th. Remember, they go from sundown to sundown. And so it's going to be sacrificed near the end of their 14th day. And the eating of the meal would begin just at sundown, and it would continue until approximately midnight. The lamb had to be eaten before midnight. So the Passover feast begins just before sundown as Nisan 14 ends, and it continues until about midnight of Nisan 15. Now, is this clear in your heads? It begins at, the Passover is at the end of the 14th. And the Nisan 15 is also the first day of the 7-day Feast of Unleavened Bread. Now, and I'll hit this again in a little bit. When the temple was built, each family in a group of pilgrims would send 1 or 2 representatives to the temple with their Passover lamb. They would go the morning of Nisan 14, which is the second half of the day of Nisan. And the daily morning sacrifices would be in progress at the temple at that time. And these are the Tamid sacrifices. And we are going to talk more about those next week, because it blew me away when I read about it and how it's connected with Passover here. Now, in the early the Tamid sacrifice was started at 9 a.m. in the morning, and it usually finished at 3 in the afternoon. But on Passover, the final sacrifice for the Tamid sacrifice was moved up to allow time for the sacrifice of these Passover lambs. And so in the afternoon of Nisan 14, the Jews with their Passover lambs would be admitted into the temple in 3 different groups. Now remember, there's probably in excess of 250,000 people and lambs there. And so one group would fill the temple courtyard, and then the gates would be closed and a service would be conducted. And this service would be accompanied by the Levite choir, and the Levites would be playing trumpets, and the entire assembly would sing the Hallel Psalms that you find in Psalms still. And during the prayers and the songs, the people would be in lines with their lambs. And each family would cut the throat of its own lamb there in the temple court, and its blood would be caught in a basin, and the basins were passed down the line of the priest from all out the temple court. And you remember how the temple is arranged, so you've got the court outside, and they'd pass down this long line all the way to the altar. And when it reached the priest at the altar, he would dash its contents at the base of the altar. Now, I've always thought, what an incredible mess is going to be there at the end of that day. But I learned reading about all this and what's going on in the temple, that at the base of the altar was a big grate, and this grate led into tubes that went down through the foundation of the temple and out into the Kidron Valley and emptied into that river that was out there in the Kidron Valley. And during Passover, the river ran red with blood because of all the blood that drained through these tubes. Now, then after each family has slain its own animal, and that service is continued for that group, each family would leave, taking its lamb back to its own family. I mean, each representative would, taking the lamb back to the family, and they would roast it whole. That's a biblical requirement. They would roast it on a dry pomegranate branch. The lamb would be cooked, the dinner would be prepared, and it would be in time for the family to be eating the Passover at the end of Nisan 14. Sundown on Nisan 14 and the beginning of Nisan 15, when the first day of the Feast of Unleavened Bread began. They would recline around their tables. They would remember the events of the Exodus. They would eat the unleavened bread, the matzah. They would eat the bitter herbs dipped in salt water, and they would eat the roasted lamb. And as midnight approached, the entire household would raise their cups and they would sing the Hallel prayers of thanksgiving. Now, this is just a real brief overview of what actually is going on. Carla's got a question.
I do have a question. Sandra, is this not the time then where in modern days the father of the household says, what are we doing, and
Yes.
you know, what are we celebrating this night, and then the children have to tell the story back?
That's exactly
Is that correct?
That's exactly right.
Okay.
And that's what we're going to be looking at.
So that's Passover.
Next week. That's the Seder. That's the formal Seder, and
sorry,
that's taking place right here. No, don't apologize. I want this to be clear. That's exactly what's going on. I'm just not going into all the detail of it at this point right now. And much of that Seder has been developed since the destruction of the temple. So all the Seder that we know now would not have been in place at the time of Jesus, but most of it was. The general form was, the template was there. Yes, absolutely. So how does Jesus fit into this picture? Now, Paul wrote to the church at Corinth in chapter 5, verse 7, Christ, our Passover lamb, has been sacrificed. So that's when we're going to be looking at the specifics here, the specifics of the shadows, the illustration of the picture that God gave to the Hebrew people many years before the reality of the person was revealed. And we're going to look at Jesus last week, the entire week before the crucifixion and resurrection, because that entire week is parallel to what's going on with this Passover lamb. It's difficult to pin down the exact sequence of events because the Gospels don't necessarily list them in chronological order throughout the week. But when it comes to the events of Jesus' final days, they are precise to the very hour. Now, I'm going to get into something a little bit controversial right here, and I just ask you to bear with me and hear me out. The church has traditionally observed Good Friday as the day that Jesus was crucified, primarily because Mark's gospel tells us in chapter 15, verse 42, it was preparation day. That is the day before the Sabbath, when Joseph went to Pilate and asked for Jesus' body. And so they're going, okay, it's the preparation day. It's the day before the Sabbath. What day is the Sabbath on? The Sabbath is always on Saturday. So this has to be on Friday. But we need to remember a couple of things. Let me go back and share the screen here just a minute. I'm going to hit this day business again because it's super important. The Jewish day began with the evening hours from 6 p.m. to nightfall, and it lasted until the end of the daylight hours we'd say it the next day, but it's part of their day, nightfall of their day. So the weekly Sabbath began. See, here's our day. And so our day starts at 12, our Friday would start at 12 a.m. Friday morning. It would, here we've got 6 a.m. would be Friday dawn. Here's 12 p.m. Friday noon, 6 p.m. Friday dusk, 12 o'clock midnight, we go from Friday to Saturday. The Jewish day, their Saturday or Sabbath begins at our dusk on Friday. And so they would have the first half of their day is night. It starts at dusk, it goes till midnight, then you have their dawn at 6 a.m. This is the second part of their day at noon and continues to dusk. And at that point, this would, at 6 p.m., their Sunday starts. That would be 6 p.m. on our Saturday, but their Sunday starts then. Is that clear enough? If you have, I'll be glad to send out some information on more on this if you want it. But moving on, every weekly Sabbath had a day of preparation on the preceding day. So every Saturday, Friday was the preparation day to prepare for the Saturday because no work could be done. They had to be finished with their preparations by sundown on Friday in order to observe correctly their Sabbath. So when Mark says that Jesus was crucified on the day of preparation, the day before the Sabbath, the church has assumed this to be Friday afternoon, which would have preceded the weekly Saturday Sabbath. But there is a question about that. There are a number of other Sabbaths in addition to the weekly Sabbaths. We talked about them earlier. God refers to these special Sabbaths as sacred assemblies or high Sabbaths, and no work is to be done on them either. And God specifically says that the first day of the Feast of Unleavened Bread is a high Sabbath. And they are to eat bread with no yeast for 7 days. And the last day of the feast is also a high Sabbath. And we know already that Passover and the Feast of Unleavened Bread overlap. The lambs are killed in the afternoon of Nisan 14, and they are eaten at a dinner that starts at dusk or sundown, about 6 o'clock, which is the beginning of Nisan 15, and they continue until near midnight on Nisan 15. And that's the first day of the Feast of Unleavened Bread. So when the Gentile church read the Gospels that say Jesus was killed on the day of preparation, did they take into account the fact that this day was before the high Sabbath of the Feast of Unleavened Bread and not necessarily before the weekly Sabbath? We've got to get a high Sabbath in there somewhere. Now, John 19:31 makes it a little bit clearer for. He says, now it was the day of preparation, and the next day was to be a special Sabbath, a high Sabbath, because the Jews did not want the bodies left on the crosses during the Sabbath. They asked Pilate to have the legs broken and the body taken down. Because it was the Jewish day of preparation for the high Sabbath, he didn't say that, but that's what he's already said. And since the tomb was nearby, they laid Jesus there. Now, if we do take this special Sabbath into consideration, and we remember that Jesus rose on Sunday, we can back these things up and see that the weekly Sabbath is always on a Saturday. The high Sabbath of the Feast of Unleavened Bread would have been on Friday, and Passover Day, the day of preparation for that feast, was actually a Thursday. Now, we have to acknowledge that could the high Sabbath have been on the same day as the weekly Sabbath? Yes, it could have been. And then the preparation day would have been on a Friday. But one of the most important things we need to remember is what Jesus said about himself. He said in Matthew 12:38, the Pharisees and the teachers of the law are challenging him, and they say, "We want to see a miraculous sign from you." And Jesus says, "A wicked and adulterous generation asks for a miraculous sign. This is the only sign that will be given. Just as Jonah was 3 days and 3 nights in the belly of a huge fish, so the Son of Man will be 3 days and 3 nights in the heart of the earth." So Jesus clearly states here that he would be in the heart of the earth for 3 days and 3 nights. And I take this seriously. I think he meant exactly what he said. And I can't see how a Friday crucifixion followed by resurrection before the dawn on Sunday morning allows for 3 days and 3 nights in the earth. Now,
Thank you, Sandra, because I've always been like tripped up about that. It has always bothered me. This makes
me too.
Sense.
Well, let me go ahead with this and you'll see where I'm headed with this. Now, he's speaking of his soul, not his body, because remember, his body never went into the heart of the earth. His body went into a tomb, which was on the surface of the earth. But his soul departed from his body at 3 p.m. on the day he was crucified. And he had told the believing thief, "Today you shall be with me in paradise." So we know paradise was the place of the dead at that point, and we'll look into this more in a later study. But please understand there are 3 reputable views on this subject, and there's lots of good scholarship on each one of them. And I do not profess to be a scholar on this, but these are some of the things that have been brought to my attention as I've studied for it, and this is what I'm offering for your consideration. There is the traditional view of the Friday crucifixion, which has lots of problems with it. There is the view of a Thursday crucifixion, which I'm leaning toward. And then there's even a good argument for a Wednesday crucifixion. And proponents of that view believe that the weekly Sabbath and the high Sabbath were separated by a regular day. That the first day of the Feast of Unleavened Bread was actually on Thursday and was a high Sabbath, and that Friday was a regular day, and then Saturday was the weekly Sabbath. And they support this position with Luke 23:54, where Luke says it was preparation day and the high Sabbath was about to begin. So the women followed Joseph and saw the tomb and how his body was laid in it. And then they went home and prepared spices and perfumes, but they rested on the Sabbath in obedience to the commandment. So this would give them a day between the Sabbaths to do the preparation of spices and perfumes. Now, if this interests you, I encourage you to do some research. You can Google "when was Jesus crucified," and you will get a bazillion articles on it, and just read through them and make up your own mind, see what makes sense to you. It doesn't affect the significance of the death and resurrection of Jesus, and this should never be a divisive element. It's a good item for a discussion, but it's not a reason for an argument. We can't be dogmatic about it because the scriptures don't say specifically which day of the week Passover was on that year, and it changes from year to year. And another thing that we have to consider is that there were differences in the way the Jewish world and the Gentile world counted. That sounds kind of weird, but the Jewish way of counting did not have a zero. For when a child was born, he was 1, and 12 months later, he was 2. So there are a lot of things to consider, and I don't profess to be an expert on any of it. But at this point, I am persuaded toward a Thursday crucifixion, and it just makes more sense to me with the little that I know and that I've learned. But I reserve the right to change my mind on this. And if you see contradictory evidence for either view, I'm interested and I'm open to hearing it.
Sandra, can I, Becky here, can I ask a
Yes.
question
Sure.
on if he were, and it says in Matthew that as Jonah was 3 days and 3 nights in the belly of a huge fish, whale, whatever. If Christ were crucified on Thursday, are we counting Thursday as day one?
Yes. You have
That's a
to,
whole, but
because
Thursday,
counted any part of the day as the day. And so
okay.
that he died at 3. So you,
Okay, that brings another question. What is the
Okay.
Tamid sacrifice? That
I'm-
was from
I'm
9 to
going to talk
3.
about that next week, Becky, if you'll hold on to that question, because it's really cool. Where were you?
Correlates, okay.
What were you? Finish your sentence though. What do you know?
Well, I was gonna say that isn't that the time Christ died, but you'll probably touch on that.
Yes, I will.
Okay,
So hold on to that.
I will.
So the following then here is just as a sequence of events, a general sequence of events about of how things happen as best I understand it right now. And I'm going to go through with it with a scripture, and then I'm going to go through it again with a chart. So remember that God instructed the Jews to set aside their lambs on the 10th day of the month of Nisan. And John 12:1 tells us 6 days before the Passover, Jesus arrived at Bethany where Lazarus lived, whom Jesus had raised from the dead. And we go ahead and read that, and we find that there's a dinner in his honor there, and that Mary pours nard on his feet, and Judas objects. And since we know that Passover is on the 14th of Nisan, Jesus arrives 6 days before, so he arrives at Bethany on the 8th of Nisan, and he spent the night there with his friends. And then the next day, the great crowd that had come for the feast, heard that Jesus was on his way to Jerusalem. They took palm branches and went out to meet him, shouting, "Hosanna." Now, we get the picture of the procession into Jerusalem, and it looks like it's early in the morning. But a careful reading of the text there, I think, shows us that it's late in the afternoon, because Mark says in chapter 11, he describes the triumphal entry, and he says, Jesus entered Jerusalem and went to the temple, and he looked around at everything, but since it was already late, he went out to Bethany with the 12. So he returns to Bethany and spends the night. And then Mark says, the next day, as they were leaving Bethany, Jesus curses the fig tree. On reaching Jerusalem, Jesus entered the temple area and began driving out those who were buying and selling there. So, see, Jesus didn't just ride into Jerusalem as a triumphal entry, go straight to the temple and drive out the money changers. He went in, looked at the temple, saw what was going on. It was late. He went back to Bethany and spent the night with his friends. And then he comes into Jerusalem again and goes to the temple and drives out the money changers. Now, God had told the Israelites to set aside the lamb chosen for the Passover on the 10th of Nisan. They were to bring it into their homes, and they were to examine it until the 14th of Nisan to see if anything was wrong with it. 2 reasons God did that, I think. One was so that they could have it there so closely examine it for enters defect or on Nisan blemish that he is now in the house casually looking of at Israel. And secondly, so that these families would get attached. He goes through a rigorous examination by the religious leaders and the government officials all that week, all the way up to Nisan 14, and they could never trip him up. They did everything they could to discredit him, but they could not find anything wrong with him. Not one spot or blemish was uncovered. Mark 14 tells us the Passover and the Feast of Unleavened Bread now were only 2 days away, and the chief priest and the teachers of the law were looking for some way to arrest Jesus and kill him. but not during the feast, they said, or the people may riot. Now, this is one of the places where it's a little confusing. When did the Last Supper take place, and was it technically a Passover dinner? Matthew, Mark, and Luke say on the first day of the Feast of Unleavened Bread, the disciples came to Jesus and asked, "Where do you want us to make preparations for you to eat the Passover?" Sounds like this occurs on Passover Day. But when we look at the original text, it actually says, and on the first, this is the literal translation, and on the first of the unleavened food came the disciples near to Jesus, saying to him, "Where wilt thou that we may prepare for thee to eat the Passover?" The word day on the first day of the feast is not in the original text. And John 13, 1 through 5 says it was just before the Passover feast. Jesus knew the time had come for him to leave this world and go to the Father. The evening meal was being served, and the devil had already prompted Judas Iscariot to betray Jesus. And John goes ahead and describes how Jesus washes the disciples' feet, and then how he identifies the one who's going to betray him as the one that's sharing the dish with him. It's Judas. And Jesus quietly tells Judas to go on with what he's got planned. And it says that nobody is surprised when Judas leaves, because he handles the money bag, and they figure that Jesus had told him, "Buy those things we need for the feast, or give something to the poor." And the rest of John 13 makes it clear that this is what we know as the Last Supper. And a close look at the timeline shows us that this is happening at the beginning of Nisan 14, which is at night. And John 18 shows us Jesus being arrested later that night, which is still on the night, the first half of Nisan 14. And in verse 28 through 29, John explains, "Then the Jews led Jesus from Caiaphas to the palace of the Roman governor. By now it was early morning." That's the morning of Nisan 14, which is the second half of the day. "And to avoid ceremonial uncleanness, the Jews did not enter the palace because they wanted to be able to eat the Passover." So it's clear here that the meal Jesus ate was eaten the night before the regular Passover would be eaten. Now, let's back up and get the rest of the scene at the table after Judas left. Luke 22:39 tells us that Jesus went out to the Mount of Olives and his disciples followed him. And we find in other of the Gospels that after he instituted, "This is my body, this is my blood," they ate, he talked, they sang a hymn. It was Psalm 118. And then they went out across the Kidron Valley into an olive tree, and here Jesus prays. And it was here that the soldiers and the officials from the chief priest and the Pharisees came to arrest him, and the examination continued. So during Passover Day, Nisan 14, early in the middle of the night, Jesus is taken to the house of the high priest, Caiaphas and Annas, and he was mocked, and he was beaten, and he was blindfolded, and he was challenged. And Luke says, at daybreak, the council of the elders of the people, both the chief priest and the teachers of the law, met together. And again, they grill him. And then he's taken to the Roman palace to be questioned by Pilate. And Pilate says, "I find no fault in him." And Pilate sends him to Herod, who questions him. And again, he's ridiculed and he's mocked, and he's sent back to Pilate, who calls in the chief priest and the rulers and the people. And he tells them that he has examined Jesus and there is nothing wrong with him. He is the perfect sacrificial Passover lamb. Pilate has Jesus flogged. The soldiers put a crown of thorns on him. They put a purple robe on him. They beat him again. Pilate finally yielded to the pressures of the people. He handed him over to be crucified by the Roman soldiers. They take him to Golgotha, and Pilate made them attach a notice to the cross that read, Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews. And he wrote it in Aramaic and Latin and Greek. And all of this happened between midnight and 9 a.m. on Nisan 14, Passover Day. Now, in temple times, when Jewish families took their lambs to the temple to be crucified, tradition tells us that they would put a sign with the family name around the neck of their lamb because they wanted to make sure they received the same lamb, their lamb, to take home for their family Passover dinner. This gets to me. When Jesus went to the cross, John tells us, Pilate wrote an inscription and put it on the cross, and it was written, Jesus the Nazarene, the King of the Jews, in Hebrew, Latin, and Greek. And this title in the Hebrew is Yeshua, HaNatzri Vemelech HaYehudim. And you take the first letters of each word, and it is the Hebrew
Yahweh. Oh my gosh.
Yahweh. It is God.
Wow.
Norton was an American Puritan theologian and preacher, and he said, just like the Jews put their family name on their lamb for sacrifice at the temple, God put his name on his lamb for his family, which includes you and me. Now, Mark goes ahead and says, and these times are really important. It was the third hour, that's 9 a.m., when they crucified him, when they put him on the cross. And Luke said it was now about the 6th hour or noon, and darkness came over the whole land until the 9th hour, 3 p.m., for the sun stopped shining. And the curtain of the temple was torn in two. Jesus called out with a loud voice, Father, into your hands I commit my spirit. And when he had said this, he breathed his last. Matthew tells us from the 6th hour, that's noon, until the 9th hour, 3, darkness came over all the land. And about the 9th hour, 3 p.m., Jesus cried out with a loud voice, why have you forsaken me? And onlookers, of course, offer him a sponge soaked with in wine vinegar to drink. And others said, now leave him alone and let's see if Elijah comes to save him. And when Jesus had cried out again in a loud voice, he gave up his spirit. And at that moment, the curtain of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom. The earth shook and the rocks split. John describes it saying, when he had received the drink, Jesus said, it is finished. And with that, he bowed his head and gave up his spirit. John says, now it was the day of preparation, and the next day was to be a special Sabbath. So John makes it clear that all this happens before the high Sabbath of the Feast of Unleavened Bread, which I think is on Friday. This is not just before the weekly Sabbath. And John says, because the Jews did not want the bodies left on the crosses during the Sabbath, they asked Pilate to have the legs broken and the bodies taken down. The soldiers therefore came and broke the legs of the first man who had been crucified with Jesus, and then those of the other. But when they came to Jesus and found he was already dead, they did not break his legs. You see, when a person is crucified, they sag on the cross. They can't breathe. And so they struggle to push themselves up so that they can take a breath. And to speed up death, the Roman soldiers would break their legs so that they couldn't push themselves up to get air. And we know that they broke the legs of the thieves on either side, but Jesus was already dead at that point at 3 p.m, and his bones were not broken. Now, I hope you can see this chart. I I will send a copy of this chart to you, because I think it's really important for us to see the similarities and how the time parallels. Not only was Jesus crucified on Passover Day, but the timing of his crucifixion and death parallels the sacrifice of the Passover lambs that are slain that same day. And I've said before, I'm assuming a Thursday crucifixion here on this chart, but the same thing can be applied if the high Sabbath and the Sabbath overlapped and he was crucified on Friday. This still works. You just collapse it one day. So on beginning up here, if you count back from here's Nisan 14, and the scriptures tell us that Jesus came in to Jerusalem 6 days earlier. So this would be Nisan 8, which I think is a Friday. And this is an interesting point here. If the Passover had been on Friday, then Jesus would have had to enter Jerusalem on a Saturday. 6 days before that would have been on a Saturday. And John 12:1 tells us that he came 6 days before Passover. That would have been, he would have had a Sabbath violation because he would have had to travel too far on the Sabbath. That's another point in favor of a Thursday crucifixion. So on the 8th of Nisan, Jesus is heading toward Jerusalem, and he stops in Bethany, and he eats with Mary and Martha and Lazarus. And then it says he goes on to the temple, and he looks around, but he leaves because it is late. And he goes back to Bethany for the Sabbath. He has to be back there by sundown. And so he spends Sabbath with his friends in Bethany. And he rides into Jerusalem on Sunday. Now there he cleanses the temple. He is now in the house of Israel, and he will be examined closely. That's where they decide they have to kill him. He's going to be examined by Israel's leaders, just as the lambs have been selected for the Passover feast on the 10th. They're taken home and they're examined until Nisan 14. This entire week, Jesus will be examined. And these are the things that happened. He clears the temple on Sunday. He's in the temple of Israel. He's examined all week. He's challenged by the authorities. On Monday, they want to know what authority he has to do these things. He's anointed at Bethany on Tuesday when he's having dinner at the house of Simon the leper. And then on Wednesday, that I think is when the disciples come and ask him when he wants to have the Passover meal. And they go to get it ready. Now, on Nisan the 14th, down here, and this was hard to put in a chart because remember that Nisan 14 starts at 6 o'clock on our Wednesday. If this is a Thursday Passover, it would start at 6 o'clock on our Wednesday. And that's when I think Jesus shares his last meal with his disciples. He institutes the Lord's Prayer. He prays, and late in the night, which is the beginning of Nisan 14, he is arrested, and throughout that rest of that night, he is tried by the Sanhedrin and Pilate and Herod. He's scourged, he's beaten, and he's sentenced to die. And at 9 a.m., he is placed on the cross. And at 9 a.m., the Passover lambs are being prepared for slaughter. And at 9 a.m., Becky mentioned a while ago, the Tamid sacrifice. At 9 a.m. is when the first of the Tamid sacrifices are also done. We are going to talk about those in detail next week. I can't get into it right now until we've done all this other. The Tamid, first of the Tamid lambs are, the first Tamid lamb is sacrificed at 9 a.m. in the morning, and the last of the Tamid sacrifices usually is over at 3 o'clock. But on the day of Passover, they move the Tamid sacrifice up, and they start the slaughter of the Passover lambs in the early afternoon, because they've got to get three groups of probably 85,000 people at a time, and lambs. They've got to get them all sacrificed before about 5 o'clock in the afternoon to allow the priest to get the temple all cleaned up and everything be cleared by 6 p.m. So we know that Jesus was on the cross at 9 a.m. The Gospels are very specific about that. And we know that between noon and 3 p.m., there is darkness over the land, and Jesus is suffering all during that time. And the last of the Tamid lamb was the last of all the Passover lambs and the Tamid sacrifices were done at 3 o'clock. And at that point, Jesus shouts, "It's finished." He gives up his spirit. The temple curtain is torn in two from top to bottom, right when the last of the lambs would be on the altar in front of the sanctuary. Now, as each lamb's throat was cut, I told you, by the family leader, blood's caught in the basin, passed up to the priest, tossed against the base of the altar. And then the lambs are taken back to the family for roasting on a spit over the fire. So they have to get back there in time to be prepared for the family to start celebrating Passover by the end of Nisan 14, by 6 or 7 o'clock, about that time. Josephus tells us that in AD 70, that's the last year the temple was still standing, 270,000 lambs were slain. Now, remember that God's instructions to Moses said the same night they must roast the meat over a fire and eat it along with bitter salad greens and bread made without yeast. Do not eat any of the meat raw or boiled in water. The whole animal, including the head, legs, and internal organs, must be roasted over a fire. And to roast a lamb over a fire requires a spit. There's a long bar that runs the length of the animal's body, and there's a crossbar to keep the legs open so the meat will roast evenly. And this is what it looked like.
What's cross?
God said that the Passover lamb must be eaten in one house on one night. None must be left over for the next day. And he said, don't carry any of its meat outside. Do not break any of its bones. And Jesus died before the soldiers could break his legs. So God's instructions specified that none of the sacrifice could be left over for the next day. So when the Jewish leaders rushed the soldiers to get Jesus off the cross before sundown, they were helping to ensure that God's plan was carried out. He was not left on the cross for the next day. He was not on the cross on the 15th. He gave everything he had on the 14th as the final Passover sacrifice, initiating a new covenant that delivers us from the bondage of sin and death that sin had over us. Going back to our chart, John 19:38 says, later Joseph of Arimathea asked Pilate for the body of Jesus. That happens right in here. At the place where Jesus was crucified, there was a garden, and in the garden a new tomb in which no one had ever been laid. And because it was the Jewish day of preparation, the day before the high Sabbath, and since the tomb was nearby, they laid Jesus there before sundown. So Jesus, our Messiah, ate the Passover on the evening, the beginning of Passover Day with his disciples, and he was crucified at the same time the Passover lambs were being offered in the temple. Now, you remember in Egypt, the death angel, in order to escape the death angel, the lamb had to be slaughtered. Its blood was spilled, But then we said the people had to apply the blood to the doorpost and they had to eat the lamb. This is significant. We know that Jesus died on the cross for everyone. It tells us, but not everyone applies the results of his death unless you eat the flesh of the Son of Man. Unless you eat the flesh of the Son of Man and you drink his blood, you have no life in yourselves, even though it has been there for all of us. Jesus has done all that is necessary for our freedom, but we have to take that sacrifice to ourselves. The observance of Passover, and this is so cool, the observance of Passover was so important that God provided an alternate date for those who were unable to celebrate if they were very specific for like dates. Numbers 9 tells us that the people, or if they were on a long journey and they couldn't get back for Passover. So some of the people came and said, what about us? We're unclean, but we want to, we would like to celebrate, and or we've been on a long journey. We can't do. And so God said, you're right. And he initiated what's known as Pesach Sheni, that second Passover. If a person was unclean or if they were on a journey, they could celebrate Passover 30 days after the 14th of Nisan, which would have been the 14th of the second month of the year. It is the only mandated feast that has that kind of a provision. It's a wonderful picture of missed opportunity and the merciful character of God. Although God himself had set this specific date and he gave very stringent requirements for Passover, he shows through the provision of Pesach Sheni, second Passover, that it's not too late to worship, to thank God for his provision, for the daily mercies that he shows us. We don't have to remain on the outside looking in because of something we've done that's made us unclean. We may have traveled a distant path that's led us far away from intimacy with God, but God has provided a means back if we will only hear his call to return. Isaiah reminds us in Isaiah 59:1, surely the arm of the Lord is not too short to save, nor his ear too dull to hear. And Peter tells us, you know that God paid a ransom to save you from the empty life you inherited from your ancestors. And it was not paid with gold or silver, which lose their value. It was the precious blood of Christ, the sinless, spotless Lamb of God. God chose him as your ransom long before the world began. But now in these last days, he's been revealed for your sake. Through Christ, you have come to trust in God, and you have placed your faith and hope in God because he raised Christ from the dead and gave him great glory. Year after year, Israel has celebrated God's faithfulness to his people in keeping the covenant he made with Abraham and Isaac and Jacob as he rescued them from the bondage of slavery to the Egyptians. Israel was given forgiveness and escape from God's anger at their sinfulness through the vicarious death of sacrificial animals for years. But these sacrifices had to be repeated over and over again, and more animals were killed. When you consider the incredible number of animals that were slaughtered year after year after year. And then you realize that Jesus brought a new covenant through his willing sacrifice of his own body and his own blood. And his sacrifice was done one time forever and for everyone who would accept it for themselves. Jesus, in his one sacrifice, did what all these hundreds of thousands of animals could not do. The celebration of Passover by the Israelites looked back at what had happened in their history with God. And this new covenant Passover that we celebrate, the Lord's Supper, also looks back at what's happened. And it's also a proclamation of the death of our Messiah and our acceptance of his death on our behalf. Paul wrote to the Corinthian church about the Lord's Supper, and he explained that Jesus had said, "This is my body, which is given for you. Do this in remembrance of me." And in the same way, after supper, he took the cup, saying, "This cup is the new covenant in my blood. Do this whenever you drink it in remembrance of me. For whenever you eat this bread and drink this cup, you proclaim the Lord's death until he comes." Just as Israel celebrated the Passover and passed the story on to their children, this new covenant, this is the account we have to pass on to all those who come after us. The truth of Jesus' death as Messiah, his resurrection, and what all of it means to us, including the prophecies of what is yet to be. We're going to see those as we study the fall feast. But next week, we're going to take a closer look at the Passover Seder, the actual meal itself, the questions that were asked, the answers that were given. We're going to also look at what Becky just mentioned, the other sacrifices that were taking place in the temple called the Tamid sacrifice. These are being made along with the Passover sacrifices, and the parallels between these specific happenings and between Jesus are amazing. And I'll look forward to sharing them with you.